Corla, if they say a week is a long time in politics, a year is certainly a long time. This time last year, as members were debating the finance bill, the projected adjustment that would be taking place this year was in around the sum of €2 billion between taxation, raising measures, public expenditure reductions, and so forth. Where we found ourselves 12 months later from this time last year was in a remarkable place where for the first time in 7 years a budget was actually in a recovery position and beginning to put money back into people's pockets. And what we saw was an increase in spending in a careful and targeted way. We saw taxes cut for low and middle income workers, and we saw meaningful measures that are boosting growth and continuing the recovery that is presently underway. However, what do we mean by recovery? I understand the frustration of people out there who have continued to work during the difficult years that we have endured since the financial collapse of this country. People who have worked but however have seen their household income lessen and diminish during that period of time, and who statements such as that employment is dropping by 1,000 people a month, that we are now in the bond markets and at bond rates better than they were before 2004, and people who see other financial indicators but they're not actually feeling it in their pocket. And it's in that regard that recovery is only kicking in when people do actually feel it. And that is right across both the private and public sector. And the job of this government is to ensure, as the recovery continues, that we actually ensure that that recovery is felt. And one proposal that I would make this evening is that in times of financial difficulty, governments introduce emergency budgets. And we've had emergency budgets mid-year or in times outside the normal budget cycle. They have been to actually take money out of people's pockets. As the recovery is continuing and proceeding, we should now as a government consider the introduction of a mini-budget between now and next October. We had, before the Finance Committee, a number of presentations. I see the Deputy Toomey, who's replaced me as chairperson, he was there at the time as well, where a number of the agencies that came before us said that the budget deficit that had to be corrected was in around €400 million. I think IBEC made that at the time, and it wasn't really taken seriously. What that was indicating is that money could actually be returned to people. Not given to them, but actually returned to them. And I believe a serious consideration needs to be taken by the administration to ensure that this is actually considered. I also want to address one of the aspects of the budget that certainly must be identified, this criticism that it was unfair and that there was an imbalance between low-paid and high-paid workers. I think people that have actually commented on that and in such a fashion have done so either disingenuously or have done so in a manner that was very selective. If you take a household or an individual that has a dependent, a child dependent, that's in around the 12k mark that is just coming into the USC area, that person is also qualifying for family income supplement, which is another state provision or state support that they're actually being given. So somebody with one child dependent on 12k a year, €12,000 a year, that's qualified for family income supplement, is getting 60% of the difference of €250 and €504 made up, which is about another €160 a week that they're actually getting. You add 160 to €250, and you now have the net earning of what 22 or 23,000 euros would actually bring you in. So I think it's very disingenuous for people to be looking at that 12,000 euros and not looking at the other ancillary supports and other benefits that have actually been brought in by the Department of Social Welfare and by government. And we see an extension of the type of thinking of this type of assist through the Family Assist programme that Minister John Burton Tánaiste is working on at present. I further want to go into the area of recovery in terms of maybe looking back as to what actually happened to bring us into the journey that we've uncovered over the last 7 years. At the heart of the financial crisis and meltdown in this country was how houses were traded and purchased in what are described as the bubble years. And at the heart of the financial crisis was an unsustainable housing market. As we move towards recovery, Lascam Corla, we have to not talk about recovery in the housing market, but talk about a normalised, sustainable housing market that ensures that people can afford to buy a home in a sustainable way. Because despite the financial crisis and the housing crash that happened in this country, the Irish public will continue to be a home purchasing nation, and we have to ensure that people out there who are working, people who are on average wages, can actually get access to the housing market and afford to be able to buy themselves a home. And this brings me on to the recent announcement that was made by Professor Honan with regard to loan-to-value ratios and the requirement of a 20% deposit. I think there's a lot of consideration must be given to what Professor Honan has said, and the obvious knee-jerk reaction that was given in some quarters must be resisted. We've learned, or we should have learned from the past, that we now have a regulator who is actually telling us stuff that we must actually listen to. This is the opposite to light touch regulation, so it must actually be listened to. So what I think what is actually happening here is there is an opportunity to look at a new way of having a housing market that favours home purchasers over buy-to-let investors or corporate investors, because ultimately government have to choose. You can't have a housing market in which government is actually neutral. You must have who your favoured purchaser actually is. The difficulty with the 80 to 20% LTV ratio is that that actually favours investors, because first-time buyers, who are the people who sustained the housing market and who were the people who were actually eventually locked out of the previous housing market, which led to its collapse, are going to have a difficulty with an 80-20% ratio. There's no question about that. First-time buyers come with high loan-to-value risks. So what I'm saying is that it's not that Professor Honan has to review his position. We need to look at new lending practices or a new type of product that is actually geared towards homeowners. This has been done in other jurisdictions, most notably in Canada, where they didn't have a housing crash because they had a particular type of product that was actually structured for homeowners. And a strong suggestion I would make in my own contribution this evening, Lascam Corla, is I would like to see the Department of Finance, along with the banks and along with the regulator, looking at a new type of housing purchasing approach targeted towards first-time buyers and homeowners that is sustainable, and one that actually keeps property inflation in check, and mostly in check with people's wages, where we don't see inflation running away ahead of it. So with that said, I will conclude on this point. Ireland is on the road to recovery. There's no question about that. People need to feel that recovery in their pockets, and we continue to be, despite the biggest economic crash that this country has ever faced, a home purchasing nation. And a litmus test of this recovery being real and genuine and long-term and sustainable, and to quote Minister Noonan, to show that we are taking a road less travelled, we need to design a mortgage product that is actually there to ensure that homeowners are at the front and at the preferenced end of the housing market.